Imagine a country where the average person earns less than $4,000 a year.
Right. Which is incredibly low on a global scale.
Yeah, exactly. A place where nearly half the population is living in what they call multidimensional poverty.
So they're struggling with health, education, basic living standards, the whole picture.
Right. And in any traditional economic ranking, this nation just sits firmly near the bottom.
It's just a classic low-income profile, usually.
But then the United Nations applies this completely different lens. They adjust their global development rankings to actually penalize countries for environmental destruction.
Like carbon emissions, material footprints, that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And suddenly this lower income nation doesn't just hold its ground, it actually leapfrogs wealthier, industrialized Western nations. It jumps up 3 spots on the global index.
Which is just wild. It forces us to completely reevaluate our definition of success.
Welcome to the planetary pressure paradox.
It's such a fascinating topic because for decades, the global north has basically operated under this assumption that human development is a straight paved road.
Right, like a set path everyone has to take.
Yeah, exactly. You industrialize, you burn fossil fuels, you extract a ton of resources, and in exchange, your citizens get wealthier, healthier, and better educated.
Classic trade-off.
But when you factor in the ecological cost of that wealth, the math just completely fractures.
Which is exactly why we are opening this massive dossier today for our deep dive. We've got our hands on a 33-year longitudinal study.
Spanning from 1990 all the way to 2023.
Right, tracking the developmental heartbeat of a single nation, which is Tanzania.
And it is dense. It's a highly detailed, multidimensional human development report.
It really is. The goal of this deep dive is to unpack this report for you because honestly, when you look at the raw data as the globe is just panicking over carbon neutrality,
Oh, totally panicking.
right, this East African nation almost looks like the blueprint for a low-carbon society, like some kind of future form.
It does look like that on paper.
But we have to ask the hard question here. What is the actual human cost of this green footprint?
Yeah.
Are we looking at a sustainable model for the future, or are we just, romanticizing the invisible premium of being a low-income country?
To answer that, we really have to put away the traditional GDP rankings.
Throw them out.
Pretty much.
Because
Because looking only at gross domestic product is, well, it's like trying to understand the health of a forest by only counting the tallest trees.
oh, I like that analogy.
You miss the soil quality, the underbrush, the biodiversity. You miss everything else.
Right. So to see the whole picture, we have to use the Human Development Index, the HDI.
Exactly. Because this metric actually balances longevity, knowledge, and standard of living.
And when you look at Tanzania through that specific multidimensional lens, the narrative just becomes incredibly complex.
It's a roller coaster of data.
So let's set our global coordinate for the listener. Let's just look at the baseline data from 2023.
Okay, let's do it.
I want you to picture a simple radar chart in your head, just a standard pentagon or hexagon shape.
Like in a video game when you're looking at a character's stats.
Yes, perfect. On one axis, you have wealth. On another, health. Then education, gender equality, and environmental impact.
Right?
If you map the world average across these categories, you get a somewhat balanced circular shape.
It kind of fills out the middle evenly.
But if you map Tanzania's 2023 data over that exact same chart, the shape is severely jagged.
It's highly unusual. It retracts sharply on the wealth axis, like pulling way close to the center.
Barely registering.
Yeah, but then it aggressively spikes outward in areas like gender parity and low environmental impact.
Let's put the hard numbers to that jagged shape just so we know what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
As of 2023, Tanzania's Human Development Index sits at 0.555.
Which places them 174th globally.
Right, so that's squarely in the medium-low development tier.
Medium-low, yeah.
But then you look at their Gender Development Index, their GDI, and it sits at 0.951.
That's incredibly high. It indicates a remarkably small gap in human development between men and women.
And their Gender Inequality Index is 0.504. Plus, their Planetary Pressure Adjusted HDI, which, let's just call it the PHDI from here on out so we don't stumble over it.
Good call.
That sits at 0.541.
So to understand what a 0.555 HDI actually means for the people living there, taking a snapshot of 2023 just isn't enough.
Right, doesn't tell the whole story.
We really have to look at the 33-year climb because back in 1990, Tanzania's HDI was way down at 0.381.
Wow, that is deep in the low human development category.
Deep in it.
Let's pause and visualize 1990 for a second. A score of 0.381, that means a society struggling with severe structural deficits across the board, right?
Absolutely. High infant mortality, really low literacy rates, and just profound economic stagnation.
And what was driving that stagnation at the time?
Well, the stagnation was deeply tied to the historical context of the region. The 1980s and early 90s were marked by this painful unwinding of early post-colonial economic experiments.
Right, a lot of structural changes.
Combined with severe debt crises and these harsh structural adjustment programs that essentially slashed public spending.
So the safety nets were just gone.
Basically, yeah. But the data shows they didn't stay trapped there.
Which is the amazing part.
By 2010, the curve hits this really sharp inflection point. It reaches 0.513.
Okay, so it starts speeding up.
And from there, it just continues up to the 0.555 we see today.
I did the math on that earlier. That is a massive growth rate. It's roughly 45.7% over 3 decades.
Which is astronomical for a whole nation.
Yeah, that brings up a critical question of mechanics for me. Because you don't accidentally achieve a nearly 46% increase in national development.
Yeah, you definitely don't.
Like, think about a runner who starts at the back of the pack. They don't just suddenly start sprinting twice as fast halfway through the marathon without some kind of physiological change.
Right. They found a second wind or they changed their stride.
Exactly. So I want you to think about this. What structurally changes in a society to trigger that kind of acceleration after the year 2010?
Well, the acceleration is driven primarily by a complete overhaul in public health infrastructure.
Really? Just health?
It's the biggest factor. It's all about basic human survival rates. Remember, the Human Development Index is an aggregate of 3 pillars: health, education, and standard of living.
The 3 big ones.
And in Tanzania's case, the heavy lifting of that 45% growth was done almost entirely by the first pillar.
The health data in this report is just staggering. It's what the authors call the Great Expansion.
It's a great name for it.
Let's look at 1990 again. The average life expectancy for a Tanzanian man was roughly 50.2 years.
Barely making it to 50.
And for a woman, it was about 53.8. You essentially lived half a century, and that was it. You were done.
It's a really sobering reality to think about.
It is.
Because it means an entire demographic bracket, the elders, the senior mentors, the grandparents, they were essentially just missing from the societal fabric.
But look at the 2023 data. Men are now living to about 64.2 years.
A huge jump.
And women have surged to 69.8 years. They're nearly hitting 70.
Which is incredible. We are talking about an entire population adding 14 to 16 years to their lifespan in a single generation.
That's what I want to dig into. How does a developing nation physically engineer a 16-year jump in life expectancy? Like, what are the actual mechanisms on the ground?
It really comes down to neutralizing the primary killers of the young and the middle-aged.
Okay, so stopping the early deaths.
Right. In the 1990s and early 2000s, sub-Saharan Africa was just devastated by the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Right.
It was literally hollowing out the adult workforce. People in the prime of their lives were dying.
So what changed?
The turning point was this massive, coordinated rollout of antiretroviral therapies, heavily supported by international partnerships, of course.
Right. They turned a terminal diagnosis into a manageable chronic condition.
Exactly. So they stopped losing the 30 and 40-something.
That is huge.
And simultaneously, you have this massive campaign against malaria.
Oh, the mosquito nets.
Yes, the long-lasting insecticidal nets. Plus, improved access to basic maternal health care and childhood immunizations.
So when you drastically reduce infant mortality, the mathematical average of a country's life expectancy just shoots upward.
It skews the whole average, yeah. And when you keep the middle generation alive, too, the social compound interest is immense.
I want to explore that concept of social compound interest for a second. Because if a population suddenly shifts its life expectancy from 50 to almost 70, the physical makeup of a family fundamentally changes.
It changes absolutely everything. Economically, you retain skilled labor.
Right, because your workers aren't dying.
Exactly. A teacher or an electrician isn't dying at 48 anymore. They're working, they're training apprentices, and they're contributing to the economy for another 2 solid decades.
Wow, yeah. And socially.
Socially, you have the return of the grandparent layer.
The grandparent layer, I love that phrase.
It's so important. When grandparents survive into their late 60s, they provide free, crucial childcare.
Oh, which frees up the parents.
Specifically the mothers. It allows them to enter the labor force or maybe start small businesses. Those 16 added years create this bedrock of societal stability.
Okay, so the health pillar is a resounding structural victory. The engine is running longer and healthier than ever before.
Absolutely.
But then we move to the second pillar in the HDI, education. And this is where the momentum hits some severe friction in the data.
Yeah, the education metrics are where things get really complicated.
The data reveals this glaring gap between the expectation, like the laws on the books, and the reality in the classroom.
It exposes the logistical nightmare of developing a human capital pipeline.
According to the report, a child in Tanzania today has an expected schooling span of 8.6 years.
So basically through middle school heading into high school.
Right. Based on current enrollment rates and government policy, a child entering the system should stay in school for roughly 9 years.
That's the intention.
But the actual mean years of schooling, the reality achieved by the adult population, is only 6.1 years.
Which leaves a 2.5-year deficit between intention and reality.
And I want to emphasize why this specific gap matters so much to you listening. If you are listening to this in a highly developed economy, a 2.5-year gap might mean taking time off before college.
Or maybe not finishing a master's degree.
Right, it's a bump in the road. You still have a career.
Yeah.
But in this context, missing 2.5 years of foundational education is massive.
It's the difference between learning how to read complex texts, do basic accounting, and understand civic rights.
Versus dropping out functionally illiterate.
Exactly. It's a cliff edge.
So I have to push back here. Why is this 2.5-year gap so stubborn? Like, what physically pulls these kids out of the classroom after 6 years?
We have to look at the intersection of biology, geography, and economics.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, passing a compulsory education law or pouring concrete for a schoolhouse, that's the easy part.
Sure, just building the thing.
The real friction lies in actual daily attendance. Let's take the agricultural cycle, for example. In rural areas, when harvest time hits, a family operating on subsistence farming simply cannot afford to leave crops rotting in the field.
Because that's their food for the year.
Right. So the children are required labor, they miss a month of school to harvest, they fall hopelessly behind, and eventually they just drop out.
So it's an economic mandate from the family overriding the educational mandate from the state.
Exactly. And then there is the infrastructure of puberty.
The infrastructure of puberty. What do you mean by that?
This is a massive, often under-discussed factor in the developing world. When young girls reach adolescence, a lack of private sanitation facilities in rural schools,
Oh, like functioning bathrooms.
right, combined with a lack of access to menstrual products, it means they miss several days of school every single month.
Just because they physically can't be there comfortably or safely?
Yes. And the cumulative effect of missing, say, 20% of the school year leads to massive dropout rates around ages 12 to 14.
Wow.
So this 2.5-year gap isn't a lack of desire to learn. It is the physical environment actively ejecting the student.
I want to use an analogy here just to lock this in. Building an education system with a 2.5-year dropout gap is like building a multi-million-dollar bridge across a river, but the construction stops 10 feet short of the opposite bank.
That captures the structural failure perfectly.
Right. Like you spent 80% of the money, you put in 80% of the effort, but because the bridge doesn't actually connect to the other side, no economic traffic can cross it.
And the return on investment just plummets. A 6.1-year education gets a citizen to basic literacy, but it does not equip them to transition into high-skill, high-yield labor markets.
Which brings us directly to the third pillar of the index.
The standard of living.
Right. We've looked at health, which is soaring, education, which is struggling to finish the bridge, and now we look at standard of living, which is measured by income.
And this is where the glaring chasm really opens up.
I have to ask, if life expectancy is up 16 years and kids are at least getting 6 years of schooling, why is the average income completely stagnant?
It's a great question.
Like, who is capturing the value of this healthier workforce?
This is honestly the starkest reality check in the entire dossier. The value isn't being captured.
At all.
No, because the industrial infrastructure to actually utilize that human capital simply doesn't exist yet.
Oh, man. The numbers are bracing here. Let me read this. Tanzania's gross national income, the GNI per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, is $3,514.
Right.
The global average. A towering $20,327.
It's a massive gulf.
Tanzania's income is barely 17.3% of the global average.
The economic ceiling is incredibly low.
So pause and consider this. Imagine your local economy trying to sustain 70-year lifespans, pay for schooling, and buy necessities on less than one-fifth of the average global income.
It's almost unimaginable.
Why doesn't a healthier, somewhat more educated population automatically generate more wealth? I think that's what we assume happens.
We do assume that, but human capital requires capital investment to generate returns.
Okay, explain that.
You can have a population that is living longer than ever before, but if they graduate from their 6.1 years of schooling into an economy that lacks advanced manufacturing or robust tech sectors or high-value export markets,
With nowhere for them to go.
right, their earning potential just hits a brick wall.
So they are trapped in low-yield sectors,
Predominantly subsistence, agriculture, and informal retail.
just selling things day to day.
Yeah. If you are farming a small plot of land by hand and you're relying on unpredictable rainfall, it doesn't matter if you live to be 70.
Because your daily caloric output barely covers your daily caloric needs.
Exactly. Furthermore, developing nations often export raw materials rather than processed goods.
Like what?
Well, let's take cashews. If you export raw cashews, the profit margin is tiny.
Right, the real money is in the processing.
Yes. The country that roasts, packages, and brands those cashews captures all the wealth.
Ah,
Without domestic industrialization, that $3,514 ceiling will remain bolted in place.
but here's the thing. Even that $3,504 is an average. And averages are incredibly comforting, but they're dangerous when we talk about human development.
Because they hide the extremes.
Exactly. They make for these nice, clean, optimistic headlines. Tanzania hits 0.555 HDI.
Right, everyone claps.
But what happens to that score when we actually factor in how that wealth and those resources are truly distributed across a population?
This requires us to apply a diagnostic tool called the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
The IHDI.
The IHDI, yes. It is basically a reality check on the national averages.
Let's explain how this tool works for the listener.
Go for it.
If I have $1 million and you have $0, our average wealth is $500,000 each.
So we both look incredibly comfortable on paper.
Right. But the reality is, I am hoarding all the resources, and you are starving.
And the IHDI penalizes the country's score based on the severity of that exact hoarding.
So what's the penalty for Tanzania?
It is severe. When you factor in the inequality of distribution across health, education, and income, Tanzania suffers an overall human development loss of 29.55%.
Almost 30%.
Yes. It drags their lived, real-world development score down from a hopeful 0.555 to a pretty grim 0.391.
So nearly 30% of their national progress is just vaporized by inequality.
Vaporized. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a massive hole in the bottom.
That's a great way to put it. The country is pouring in health and education progress, but extreme wealth disparity is just draining the gains at the bottom.
Exactly. And if we break down the specific dimensions of that inequality, income is the main culprit.
Not health or education.
They have some disparities, sure, but income inequality single-handedly accounts for a brutal 41.1% loss in the income dimension alone.
Wow. So where's that wealth pooling? Who has the money?
It is the classic urban-rural divide.
Right.
The wealth generated by telecommunications, banking, and specialized services, it all pools in commercial hubs like Dar es Salaam.
The big cities.
Meanwhile, the rural districts, where the vast majority of the population still relies on agriculture, are left operating in a completely different economic century.
To really understand the granular reality of that inequality, we have to look past just paper income and talk about the multidimensional poverty index.
The MPI.
The MPI, yeah. Because poverty isn't just a lack of money in your wallet.
Right. It's about what you actually have access to in daily life. The MPI measures overlapping deprivations.
So what does that look like on the ground?
It looks at the household level and asks things like, do you have a dirt floor? Do you have to walk an hour to fetch clean water? Do you have reliable electricity?
Are your children malnourished?
Exactly. It measures the texture of poverty.
And the texture in Tanzania is profoundly challenging. Because despite crossing the threshold into the medium human development tier, on paper,
Which we just celebrated.
right, 47.2% of the population still lives in multidimensional poverty.
Nearly half the country.
Almost half. What is driving that poverty? Like, what are the primary factors in that index?
This is where it gets really revealing. When you break down the index, the single largest contributor isn't the lack of assets like radios or bicycles.
Okay, what is it?
It is nutrition, which accounts for 21.9% of the poverty burden.
Nutrition. Just getting enough food.
Right. And the second largest driver is school attendance, contributing 15.0%.
Wait, let's connect the dots here.
Yeah, you see it.
We were just talking about that 2.5-year gap in education,
Mm.
and you noted agricultural labor and puberty as physical barriers.
Yes.
But this poverty data introduces a third massive barrier, caloric deficit.
Exactly. This is the vicious cycle of multidimensional poverty.
Because if a child falls into that 21.9% nutrition deficit bracket, their physical and cognitive development is compromised from day one.
They don't stand a chance.
If they are stunted, if their immune system is shot, if they literally do not have the caloric energy to walk 3 miles to a schoolhouse and focus on a chalkboard,
Then they inevitably become part of the 15% school attendance deficit.
they're the exact same kids.
They are. Which demonstrates why interventions absolutely have to be multidimensional.
You can't just fix one thing.
Right. You cannot fix the education gap by simply training better math teachers or building nicer desks. You have to implement school feeding programs.
Because if the school provides a reliable, high-calorie meal,
It solves the nutrition deficit, which incentivizes attendance, which closes the education gap, which eventually raises the income ceiling.
the systems are entirely interdependent.
Completely.
That paints an incredibly daunting picture of how hard it is to move the needle. You are basically fighting gravity on multiple fronts.
It's an uphill battle every day.
But I want to pivot here. I want to shift our focus to a completely different set of data within this report,
Okay, let's pivot.
because it subverts almost everything we usually assume about developing nations. Let's look at the gender data.
The gender metrics in Tanzania present a fascinating counter-narrative.
They really do. In many areas, they are radically restructuring gender power dynamics.
Let's start with the Gender Development Index, the GDI. We mentioned earlier it was 0.951.
Let's break that down for people.
Sure, the HDI for females is 0.542, and for males, it's 0.569.
Those numbers are incredibly close.
They are. It illustrates what we might call the fair distribution of scarcity.
The fair distribution of scarcity. I like that.
Despite the low levels of overall wealth and all the intense structural challenges we just discussed, the disparity between men and women in accessing what is available is remarkably narrow.
So if the pie is small, they are at least cutting it evenly down the middle.
Exactly. Contrast that with other developing economies, and honestly, even some high-income nations in the Middle East or parts of Asia.
Well, the gap is huge.
Right, where male human development vastly structurally outpaces female development, Tanzania has managed to embed a degree of gender equity into its developmental DNA.
But it goes way beyond just accessing basic health and schooling. This is where the dossier truly surprised me.
The political data.
Yes. Let's talk about actual hard political power. Listen to this statistic. Women hold 37.4% of parliamentary seats in Tanzania.
That is a staggering figure for any nation, let alone one in the medium-low development tier.
For context, the global average for female representation in national parliaments is a mere 26.5%.
So they are blowing the global average out of the water.
Tanzania is significantly outpacing much of the developed world, including several major Western democracies.
It's a major win.
How did they engineer a political system where nearly 4 out of 10 lawmakers are women?
It is the result of deliberate, systemic constitutional engineering.
So they forced the issue.
They did. Following the transition to multi-party democracy, the Tanzanian constitution actually mandated special seats for women in parliament.
So it isn't just left to chance.
No, or the slow evolution of voter bias. The system legally guarantees a massive block of female representation.
And we see a similar parity in the labor market, too.
We do.
The labor force participation rate for women is an impressive 74.9%, which very closely trails the 84.0% participation rate for men.
Women are highly visible in the workforce and highly represented in the government. It's a genuinely triumphant narrative.
But
Here it comes.
yeah, here's where I have to introduce a massive glaring contradiction.
The paradox.
Right, because as I read through this gender data, and I'm celebrating the 37% parliament stat, I hit a metric that made me stop cold.
The adolescent birth rate.
Yes, the ABR. It is a huge red flag in the data.
It really is the fault line in the gender narrative here.
If political power is so high, and labor participation is nearly equal, and basic human development is shared, why is the adolescent birth rate sitting at a shocking 113.2 births per 1,000 young women?
It's astronomically high.
The global average is just 39.1. Tanzania's rate is 2.9 times the global average.
Almost triple.
How does a country with such robust female leadership allow its teenagers to have babies at nearly triple the global rate?
This is what we call the gender paradox of Tanzania.
Okay, explain this to me.
You have a society that mandates and respects female political leadership at the macro level.
Up in the capital.
Right. But at the micro, granular level of rural villages, there is a profound, life-altering vulnerability for adolescent girls.
So where is the disconnect, like between the powerful female parliamentarian in Dodoma and the 15-year-old girl in the village?
The disconnect is multidimensional poverty and deep-rooted cultural norms.
Okay.
Top-down political representation does not instantly dissolve grassroots economic traps.
That makes sense.
In rural districts, a daughter is often viewed through an economic lens, unfortunately.
Right, because everyone is surviving on so little.
Exactly. So in times of severe poverty or drought, early marriage becomes a coping mechanism for families.
Oh, wow.
The family receives a bride price, which is vital income, and they have one less mouth to feed.
And once a 15-year-old girl is married and pregnant,
She drops out of school permanently.
and there goes the education pipeline.
Completely. The high adolescent birth rate is the exact mechanism that violently ejects young women from the educated pipeline.
It feeds directly back into that 2.5-year schooling gap we discussed earlier.
Yes. It locks a completely new generation of women into the lowest earning tiers of the agricultural economy,
Which completely nullifies their long-term developmental potential.
regardless of how many women sit in parliament making laws.
It's a sobering reminder that a law on the books doesn't magically alter the economic desperation of a subsistence farming family.
It doesn't put food on the table today.
Progress in one dimension doesn't automatically cure deficits in another.
It is an unfinished battle. And it highlights that while the distribution of scarcity might be fair, the impact of that scarcity still disproportionately damages young women.
Which brings our conversation full circle,
Back to the hook.
back to the massive hook that started this deep dive. We've explored the triumphant 16-year game in life expectancy.
The great expansion.
We looked at the crushing $17,000 income ceiling.
The bolted ceiling.
We talked about the multidimensional poverty traps and this incredibly complex gender paradox. Now we have to look at how Tanzania's environmental footprint interacts with all of these developmental struggles.
We return to the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
The carbon reality. Let's lay out the global context here. For decades, the world average for carbon dioxide emissions per capita has hovered around 4.0 to 4.5 tons.
That is the ecological cost of doing business on planet Earth right now.
If you want high-speed internet, paved highways, air conditioning, and a robust supply chain.
You burn 4.5 tons of carbon per person.
But Tanzania's footprint, it is an almost invisible 0.26 tons per capita.
It is basically a statistical rounding error compared to the global north.
And because of that minuscule footprint, when the UN adjusts the global rankings to penalize polluters, Tanzania is essentially rewarded.
They rise 3 spots globally.
They're labeled as incredibly green. But we need to deconstruct this green label.
We really do.
Because looking at the reality we just discussed, it feels incredibly misleading.
It is dangerous to look at that 0.26 tons and assume it represents some kind of high-tech, intentional green transition.
Right, they aren't choosing this because they have a bunch of Teslas.
Exactly. They are not running their national grid on a vast network of wind turbines and solar farms by choice. Their exceptionally low emissions are the direct, unavoidable result of low industrialization.
It's a poverty dividend.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That is the perfect term for it. They aren't emitting carbon because millions of their citizens do not have access to heavy industry.
They don't have reliable 247 electrical grids.
Or the motorized transport networks that generate all that carbon. The lack of planetary pressure is simply a byproduct of the $3,514 income ceiling and the 47.2% multidimensional poverty rate.
Right, if you are farming by hand and walking for water, your carbon footprint is near zero.
But so is your income.
And that poses a really profound existential question, not just for Tanzania, but for all of us globally.
The big question.
As this nation fights to close that massive $17,000 income gap with the rest of the world,
As they strive to pull that 47% of their population out of poverty.
and industrialize enough to keep those young girls in school instead of forcing them into early marriage, are they destined to balloon their carbon footprint to the global 4.5-ton average?
Historically, the answer to that has always been yes.
Every single time.
Every single nation that has successfully climbed from low human development to very high human development has done so by violently exploiting natural resources and burning fossil fuels.
The traditional blueprint for wealth requires environmental degradation.
It always has.
But is it possible to leapfrog? Like we saw developing nations skip landline telephone infrastructure entirely, right?
Right, they just jumped straight to mobile phone networks.
Can Tanzania skip the dirty 20th century coal and oil industrial phase entirely?
Yeah.
Can they build a wealthy $20,000 per capita economy using solar, geothermal, and wind?
That is the ultimate test of the 21st century.
Can they do it?
Well, leapfrogging energy infrastructure is infinitely more expensive and complex than leapfrogging telecom towers.
Fair point. Sticking a cell tower in a village is easier than building a power plant.
Exactly. It requires massive international capital investment. It requires open technology transfers from the global north.
So we have to share the tech.
We have to. And it requires a genuine global commitment to ensuring that developing nations aren't forced to choose between feeding their children and saving the planetary ecosystem.
Because if forced, they will choose feeding their kids.
Of course they will. If Tanzania is forced to industrialize on the cheap using coal, their PHDI will plummet just as fast as their standard HDI rises.
We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today.
We really went through the whole dossier.
Let's do a rapid-fire synthesis of what we've learned from this 33-year study. What is the overarching narrative of Tanzania from 1990 to 2023?
The narrative is that human development is a complex, uneven, and sometimes entirely contradictory terrain.
Yet it's not a straight line.
Tanzania proves that national progress is not just a straightforward accumulation of wealth. Over 30 years, they achieved incredible structural triumphs,
They neutralized devastating epidemics,
adding 16 years to their citizens' life expectancy.
and they engineered a political system that achieves world-leading gender parity in government.
Right. But those massive victories are heavily counterbalanced by severe structural friction.
They face a brutal $17,000 income gap with the global average.
They are fighting deep, multidimensional poverty driven by malnutrition.
Which creates that stubborn 2.5-year deficit in basic education.
And they face the urgent grassroots challenge of lowering the adolescent birth rate to keep young girls in the classroom and out of the poverty cycle.
So they're a society caught in the exact center of a profound transition.
Balancing vast developmental potential against the friction of trying to achieve a fair, equitable, and sustainable economy.
And that brings me to a final, lingering thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Think about your own society.
Think about the path we took.
Look at the developed world's blueprint. We, the wealthy, industrialized nations, we bought our high incomes, our long lifespans, and our comfortable averages by essentially burning the planet for 2 centuries.
We extracted everything we could.
And now we are desperately trying to engineer our way backward. We are trying to find a way to lower our massive carbon footprint without giving up our accumulated wealth.
We are trying to figure out how to put the smoke back into the chimney.
Exactly. But Tanzania, they are starting from the exact opposite end of the spectrum.
They have the low footprint, but they need the wealth.
Right. The ultimate question for the next 30 years isn't just whether Tanzania can catch up to the rest of the world financially.
That's the old question.
The real question is whether they, and nations like them, can invent a completely new blueprint for human progress.
A blueprint where wealth, longevity, and education don't have to cost us the earth.
Because if they can figure out how to build a wealthy society from scratch, on a foundation of clean energy and gender equity,
Then they won't just be catching up to the developed world.
they will be the ones leading it.
A totally new paradigm for progress.
A perfect place to leave it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We encourage you to always keep questioning the numbers behind the global headlines, to look for the structural paradoxes, and to remember that behind every macro statistic is a granular human reality. Until next time.